Hello and a warm welcome to this week's edition of Invest Africa. I'm Godfrey Mutizwa. Now, there is a sense of urgency to kickstart large investment infrastructure projects on the African continent. After years of low investment, African governments are aiming to transform their economies with infrastructure at the core and also create jobs. This week, we will be looking at Africa's top 6 infrastructure projects and unpacking some of the challenges that come with managing these large-scale investments. Tumiswa Mahanyele brings us this report.
Africa has seen unprecedented economic growth in recent years, and with the rising middle class, a mushrooming of the African population, and rapid urbanization, global cities will need to be more sustainable.
Absolutely critical, particularly to the landlocked countries that have abundant resources. So whether it be coal or copper or some of the other minerals, getting those materials to port is critical.
Whether it is turning on a tap, accessing the internet or transporting goods across borders, Africa's infrastructure has been perceived as less reliable and expensive. Financing costs, skilled labor and efficient project management are just some of the factors holding back development.
It is very important to implement regional projects when it's not a priority. There's the issue of ownership of this project. That is one. There's also the issue of harmonization of regulation and rules across boundaries. There's also the issue of financing this infrastructure project. And now we are talking about the private sector involvement in infrastructure development. But we have to be careful because some of these infrastructure projects are perceived as public goods. So it's not very easy to get the private sector to just jump into it.
According to the African Development Bank, a shortage of water, housing, roads, and adequate sanitation reduces the output in sub-Saharan Africa by as much as 40%. Despite all the challenges facing infrastructure development on the continent, there have been some very impressive success stories. The latest Infrastructure 100, released by KPMG, identified the top 100 infrastructure projects in the world, and 6 of these projects are from Africa. Among the 6 is South Africa's Durban Waste to Energy project. Another proudly African project is the BRICS cable, which is among the largest and most ambitious project on the 100 list. The BRICS submarine cable is a 34,000-kilometer underwater fiber optic cable system that will link the cities in the BRICS economies, namely Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa with the USA. This project is aimed at substantially improving broadband capability on the continent. With projects like these setting the standard, transforming Africa's infrastructure seems to be on the correct path, and the current infrastructure boom will not only support urban cities, but will also be able to provide for grassroots communities. Tumiswa Mahanyele, Johannesburg.
Joining me now in the studio to discuss the state of infrastructure on the continent with a particular view on the top 6 infrastructure projects are Boyce Scott. He is Head of Infrastructure for Africa at KPMG. And in our Lagos Bureau, we've got Wale Shonibare. He's Managing Director, Investment Banking at UBA Capital. And on the line from Nairobi, Kenya, we'll be joined by Gabriel Negatu, the African Development Bank's East Africa Regional Director. Gentlemen, welcome to you. Let's begin here in Johannesburg and just perhaps give a little context around these top 6 projects. Now, these are chosen by KPMG, well, under the umbrella of KPMG, but by experts across the whole spectrum, from architects to perhaps academics who look at these projects and decide these projects are good. Let's just celebrate the fact that we've got top 6 projects that are coming from the African continent that are part of the top 100 that are being chosen by KPMG. Why were these projects part of this large group of the top 100?
Good afternoon, Godfrey. I think it's important to appreciate that it's part of a study that we as KPMG did together with Infrastructure Journal. It's a partnership that started 2 years ago, where we were looking at issues around big cities. Throughout the world, big cities right now already comprises 50% of the population of the world are urbanized. That's rapidly growing. It's expected that over 1.3 billion additional people will be added in the developing world. Africa per se is expected to grow up to 70% of the entire population in Africa big cities. That big cities in the world in area comprises a mere 2% of the livable area, on the continent.
Right.
So that means, in simple terms, the infrastructure in cities are under severe pressure.
Yeah.
And it needs to be looked at differently than before. You can't just look at a power station or a road or a hospital in isolation. It's now time to look at these all on a consolidated basis. Have a master plan. Make sure that these projects are meaningful, that they are sustainable, and that they make a contribution. This project looked at 10 various sectors, from health to transport to communications to education, etc. All the typical infrastructure areas, identified throughout the world on an independent basis 100 projects. 6 of them are from the continent, looking at size, sustainability, innovation, etc. And that's where the 6 from South Africa through independent panels were elected.
Yeah, so 6 from Africa are on that top 100 list. But we do know that, of course, I'm glad we're now moving the discussion further from, do we need infrastructure? Where do we need the infrastructure? How much do we need? Because the discussion around the fact that there isn't enough money going around to pour into infrastructure has been going for a long time. So let's just look at some of the projects. Some of them are not your typical ones. For instance, I was looking at the list here and I saw this one that came in on the Durban Waste to Energy project. Ordinarily, when we talk infrastructure, we talk the hard stuff, your railways, your roads, your power stations, as you were saying. So let's just briefly discuss the Durban one.
I think the Durban one, for example, falls into the waste to power energy sector. And if you look at the 5 criteria I mentioned, one of which was innovation and something meaningful, something different. Waste to energy in Africa is waste in Africa per se is a real issue that needs to be dealt with. The Durban Waste Project, with the methane gas that's released in these waste dumps, will have the capacity to provide electricity to between 5,000 and 6,000 households. Now imagine you can replicate that throughout the continent.
Yeah.
Now that's what that project was all about. It was elected because of those contributions it's making.
Yeah, well, let me come to you in Lagos and speak about whether you think the top 6 that have been identified here are perhaps omitting bigger projects that in your view perhaps should have been on this list.
Yeah, hello there. Any project list is going to be subjective because it depends on the criteria being used to pick those projects. But the main issue to recognize is that there are some key infrastructure sectors where we've identified a big gap across Africa. And the main ones being power, transportation, telecoms to a certain extent has been a success. So if you go to any country, you can pick your 6 projects, either in terms of size or level of innovation or the contribution that it will make to economic growth. In Nigeria, there's a particular issue with power. So the power sector privatization that's going on here is very critical to economic growth over the next few years.
Yeah.
Having said that, there are also independent power projects that are being pursued. Each of these are significant in their own right.
Yeah, but while the fact that perhaps that didn't make this top 100, that was chosen, as I said earlier, by professionals, including academics and guys who are in construction, finance, law, and public policy, and all those kind of things, doesn't that perhaps suggest that perhaps it's not on the scale that it ought to be, and perhaps it just wasn't maybe outstanding enough?
Well, I wasn't party to the drawing up the criteria, so I'm not quite sure what criteria were applied. But certainly, these are significant projects in terms of the impact they're going to have on the general populace and also the extent to which they're able to raise living standards that bring more people out of poverty. So
yeah.
I think, yeah. So that's my view. We can always have discussions about which ones should have made the list and which shouldn't.
Absolutely. Let's take the conversation to the African Development Bank, because of course they do look at the continent as a whole. Mr. Negatu, let me come to you and ask, I'm hopeful that you heard the projects that we're talking about, but maybe let me just quickly run through them. Is the BRICS cable project, is the O3B networks project, the Durban Waste to Energy project that we discussed with Dibash, as well as the Blue Line of the Lagos Railway network in Nigeria, Ethiopia's Djibouti Railway, and King Mamo Hato Memorial Hospital in Lesotho. Mr. Negatu, from where you stand, are those the big ones, or are they the bigger ones that didn't make it here?
I don't think there is any shortage of big projects in any region in this continent. I think, of course, big is a relative word, but still, in the east, if I may take, for example, Kenya, they've got some huge ones. The LAPSET project with envisioned infrastructure from Lamu to South Sudan, railways going all the way to South Sudan and into Ethiopia. In Uganda, in the same thing, some huge hydro powers and so on. So I haven't seen this list you are talking about, but I suspect there's really no shortage. And this that you have mentioned, at least I know of two of them, the Ethio-Djibouti and the Blue Line, definitely are huge, are big. Now, what criteria was used to cut off and at what point the cutoff was set, I'm not sure, but I think they're big and worthy of financing.
Yeah, I'm using the 6 to spark debate and, get us talking about what we need to do, of course. I mean, from where the African Development Bank stands, I do know that the bank is focusing quite a lot on infrastructure development across the whole of the African continent. In terms of what you guys have done and the amount of work you have put in, how much more do you think we ought to be doing? And from a bank perspective, perhaps just give us a sense of what you are doing.
Well, you're quite right. We are very heavily committed to infrastructure work in the East Africa region and across the continent, I should hasten to add. But let me talk about East Africa. We have invested quite heavily, and we are online to do much more. As I said, Kenya has huge projects in the pipeline relating to the LAPSET project. Uganda has some major infrastructure projects, including possibly a pipeline, hydro projects. Tanzania, the same thing. We're scheduled to do the backbone, electricity backbone connecting by a transmission line, Tanzania and Kenya. That will form part of the East Africa power pool, which will then connect to the Southern Africa power pool, so power can be traded between Eastern and Southern African countries. Rwanda has 2 or so hydro projects coming up. And then we've got the NELSAP project, which connects by grid, power grid, all of the East African countries. So in total, I think we are set to do quite a bit. The same with the road sector, the same with ports and so on. So infrastructure will remain a flagship sector for us in the coming years.
Absolutely, and we'll continue that conversation when we go into the second half. For now, we need to take a quick commercial break. Please do stay tuned.